So if you've been looking around at your nonprofit and you're noticing that feedback isn't regularly given at your organization, or maybe you've asked for feedback and you haven't really received that, or maybe you have received feedback, but the feedback that you've gotten hasn't actually been helpful and maybe it was harmful in some instances, um, and maybe you have a leadership position where you're like, how do we change this, right? So that's probably why you're tuning into this video, and I'm so glad that you are. I'm really going to break down what you can do, whether you're a leader of one and maybe you're just trying to do your part to really make sure that your organization is making the change that they want to do, and you really are passionate about this work, and you want to make sure that you're doing what you can do as well. Or maybe you are a leader of 10 people, right? That maybe you supervise a whole bunch of folks and you want to make sure that you are creating an environment where there's open communication, feedback is given in a way that is helpful and accurate, and is really met with the intentions that you'd like to have. So again, today I'm going to kind of break down what you could do. If you are not familiar with me, my name is Petra Vega. I go by a variety of self-described names. But really what I am passionate about is really creating workplaces that are places of healing and not harm. And I really do that work by working with BIPOC and LGBTQ plus nonprofit leaders so that they can feel more confident and consistent in being able to speak up and leverage the power that is within their voice, within their narrative, even when self-doubt may be getting in the way. And so I've kind of had a variety of lows in the nonprofit sector, as an organizer, as a director, did grassroots work, I've been a mentor, I've worked in a variety of issues, and so that really is where my lens is coming from as someone who works with nonprofit leaders who really want to be able to align their values to the work that they're doing. And I wanted to offer, if you are here with me live, feel free to say hi in the chat. I've got it pulled up on my phone here to make sure that I don't miss anyone or miss anything. But if you're here with me live, you have an opportunity, if you're able to stay till the end, to win one of two things. So one, if you're here with me live, you'll be entered for a chance to win either one, a free one-time coaching session with me. Maybe we can talk about feedback. Maybe we can talk about how to create change in your organization. Maybe we talk about boundaries, whatever you want to talk about, really around how can I support you in your leadership. That is something that's up for grabs, this one-on-one coaching session. I call them spark sessions. And then the other thing, let's say you want to do more DIY on your own time. I have this workshop series around building your anti-oppression lens and language called the So You Want to Be Less Oppressive. It's a 3-part series. So you can have one of those two things if you're someone who's chosen to win, but you'll have to stay till the end because I'll tell you how you can enter for a chance to win. So I want to offer that. And then the next thing I wanted to do is for you to be aware of, like, what are we doing today? So what I'm covering is what can we do as individuals to really co-create that culture of feedback at your organization. I'm going to get into what we can do interpersonally. So maybe if you are someone who's supervising a few folks, or maybe you're someone who really wants to build stronger relationships with your colleagues, or maybe you already have those kinds of relationships, so you want to be able to test and leverage more of a feedback culture between you all to kind of test that. And then you can bring that to the leadership around like, hey, this is something we've been kind of playing around with. Can we bring this larger to the organization? We really see the impact of it. And then the last thing I want us to get into is what we can do institutionally, right? Because we know that culture isn't a person. Culture is a variety of people. It's the thing we can't quite touch, but it has so much impact around whether or not our workplaces are places of healing or trauma, which is the thing that I really care about. To support you on this journey, I want to offer to you my free Feel Good Feedback Guide. This is the resource that I have. She is rather robust. I go into exactly much deeper into what I'm going to get into this video in terms of like, how do you set yourself up for feedback success? What are some things to stray away from? Some things not to do when it comes to feedback. I often find that it's helpful to kind of name and describe, okay, what's the outcome or the expectation that you want, but it can also be helpful to hear like what not to do. So you can kind of like figure out what's the place that you want to be at. And the way that you can access this, if you are watching on the big screen, which is where I watch all of my YouTube videos, not just my own, but other people's. You can scan the QR code on the screen right now, or if you're watching this on a computer, feel free to grab your phone, scan the QR code. If not, I tried to make this like a nice quick link for you. You can also go to tinyurl.com/Petra's feedback guide, and you'll be able to find the feedback guide there. And so I'll leave this on the screen for a few seconds. Welcome some people. Hi, everyone. Yeah, if you're just joining us now, feel free to say hello in the comments or in the chat. Yeah, so you have this guide to kind of help you along. Again, I'm going to give you as much as I can in this video. I want to be thoughtful about time and bandwidth. But if you really want to go much deeper, I highly suggest that you get this guide. All right, so let's get into it. So the first thing, right, bare minimum, regardless of what your role is in your nonprofit, regardless of the responsibilities there, the one thing I think we can all do is some of the things I'm going to display here in this section are what we can do as individuals. I'm someone that really thinks about what are the beliefs, what are the ideas that are underpinning certain actions, and I think one of the places that we really fuck it up when it comes to feedback is in really not thinking about how the other person wants to receive that feedback. And so really, I want to invite you to take on this belief that I have that feedback is about the receiver and not the giver. I maybe you've heard the phrase that feedback is a gift, but like some gifts, they suck. Some gifts are not good gifts, right? Maybe you're someone who might think that like, oh, I should be appreciative of this gift, but some gifts are not that good, and it's okay for us to name that. And so I think it's the same thing with feedback, that some feedback is just not that good. Maybe the paper's wrong, maybe it's an item that you didn't ask for. And so I think we really want to start, what could be really successful around creating this culture of feedback, is really embracing this idea that feedback is about the receiver and not the giver. And so in this section, I want you to think of yourself as the giver. And think about, okay, if I were to hold on to this belief, what are some of the values that I want you to start embracing and thinking about as you're crafting your own feedback when you give it to other people, or when even when someone might ask you, like, how do you like to receive feedback, or for you just to know whether or not people ask you. And so the first value I want you to kind of think about is this one around being trauma aware. Again, it doesn't need to be that you are a trauma expert, you know everything about trauma, but at least having some understanding that the words that we use, how we approach people, what we say and we don't say has an impact, could have a very big negative impact on people, because I think sometimes we can think about feedback too loosely. I don't think that we kind of treat it with the care that it deserves, and that's what creates some traumatic experiences, right? Where we don't bring our attention and we don't address things with care. So I want us to kind of think about, like, okay, how can I be thoughtful that maybe feedback can be traumatic? The other thing I want us to invite is that how can we make our feedback consent-based, right? How can this really be a choice for people to receive? How can people be in their agency to ask for it, to say no if they're not ready to hear it? I find that sometimes we really want to give feedback immediately, but that person that we want to give it to may not be ready. And so I really want to invite us to slow down, to create some consent here, because that's really going to change the game in terms of how your feedback is received or not. And the last value I want us to think about is generative, which you kind of can't see on the screen because my video is covering, and I apologize for that. But by generative, I mean that it is intending to grow, right? Sometimes I think we give feedback and we may not notice how really it's criticism, or it's around control, or it's around like your own personal preferences about something. But really, if we want to create feedback, or want to give feedback that is generative, it really is meant to grow and build this person up. It's built to build on top of this person, and not to really diminish them and then build them up. Really want to, but I come from a place of like, where you are is good, and how can we be better? So those are some values I want you to consider. And now I want you to think about different facets of how I think about feedback in these three ways. So the first lens I want you to kind of look at is, how do you like to receive, how would you like feedback to be given, right? And this really is talking about, okay, what is what do you want it to be in person? Is it virtual? Is it written, or is it verbal? I want you to kind of think about, okay, when you really receive feedback that's really been excellent, how did they do that? What was the makeup of that interaction? Because I want you to try to replicate that, right? Like if we already know that something is working, I want us to repeat those things. So that's the first one, for you to think about how would you like feedback to be given. And if you want more support or more questions about this, again, I highly suggest getting the Feel Good Feedback Guide. But what I'm also going to do is going to link, I did another video around this that goes much deeper to these questions. So I'm going to link that to this video as well if you're not here live. The next thing I want you to think about is what framing would help feedback feel good for you, right? Is there a certain sentence or phrase that might feel good? For example, for me, I really like to hear feedback that says, I think you did X really well, and I think given what I know about you wanting to grow in Y area, I think maybe trying Z next time would be great, right? That's like, oh, I really want the acknowledgement of what I'm doing well, so that I know that I could, my nervous system will be a little bit more settled. It won't be on the attack. And I want you to acknowledge, what are the ways that I've described how I want to grow? And then, offer to me what I could be doing differently. I really like that. When I've done this with other folks that I've supervised, they have come up with statements or framings that are like, I know you're still learning, and here's what I would suggest you do, given that I was in a similar position before, right? So really coming from this place of I know that this is new for you. I want to acknowledge that for you and for me, that this is new and different. And here's a suggestion I have based on my prior experience, okay? So those are just a few frames that you might want to think about, but how would someone need to phrase it to you, right? Because oftentimes someone might say, can I give you some feedback? And then people immediately are like, people are freaking out over that statement. And so what's now that we know that, right, that might be a traumatic way to phrase it, kind of think about what could we do to soften that a little bit. The last thing I want us to think about is, when is the best time for you to ask for feedback, right? Or when is the best time for you to receive that feedback? For some people, might be immediately after, maybe a workshop I just led, I want to get feedback on, maybe I facilitated this big event, maybe it was a board meeting, or there were some folks that were visitors that I wasn't sure how I did. I really want to hear immediately after, right? That might be your preference. For some people, it might really be, I really want some space from whatever you're giving me feedback from. Could you give me feedback later, right? Maybe in a day or two. Maybe it's in the morning. Maybe you're someone like me, I have the most energy and I'm most alive in the morning, versus when I'm in the afternoon, I'm not really my best self, right? And so this is, again, all of these questions are for you to think about, okay, what do I really need to do my best work? How do I really want to think about, how do I want to grow? I really want to invite you to take that space and that agency for you to get to decide that, because that's just going to help you create this culture and be a part of it when you know those things for yourself. So I'd love to know in the chat or in the comments, feel free to let me know, out of all of these 3 different questions, how would you like feedback to be given? What framing would help feedback feel good for you? And when is the best time for you to ask for feedback? How many of these do you feel like you know the answer to for yourself? Is it one of these? Is it 2 of them? Is it all 3? If so, you're in really great shape. I'd love to know in the comments, how many of these do you have already kind of set up for yourself? You're I feel good about this. And I'm okay, I'm doing my part as an individual to know the answers to these questions. And I'll give us a few seconds. All right, okay, great. So maybe there's some 2, 3, maybe 1. That's okay. Wherever you're at is okay. All right, so what can we do interpersonally? Here is where we might be able to do a little bit more stretching, right? If you're in a place where you're as an individual, I'm doing all that I can to create a feedback culture, and me personally knowing how to receive feedback, and you taking on that mindset, that belief that feedback is about the receiver and not the giver, you're doing a great job. Now I want us to get into what can we do interpersonally. And so maybe this is something you're doing with your colleague, maybe it's something you're doing with someone you supervise, but just really what are you doing in relationship to other people? I want to kind of give some recommendations on that. So the first thing I want us to consider is that I think about feedback as like a 3-part process. If you haven't been able to tell, I really like 7 threes. So I'm like, I got three lenses, 3 prongs for us to think about how do you like to receive feedback, and I have 3 phases around how I think you could engage with feedback to be able to create this culture of feedback. So for the first stage, I really think that there should be a before process. Again, this is stuff that I've tested and tried for myself, and I've found that when we really have a conversation before we even try to give feedback, it really shifts what's possible in that relationship. It really opens the communication. That person is so much more open to hearing the feedback that I have to offer, and they also feel more comfortable to share it, right? And that those things are really necessary in order for people to take action with our feedback. So in this section around, okay, what are we doing before feedback? I want you to talk about these 3 things with the person that you're supervising, or maybe a colleague that you want to kind of play around with this with. So I want you to think about, I want you to ask this person, how do you want to grow, right? Ask this person, are you someone, do you want to, improve your meeting facilitation skills because you really care about inclusion and people feeling welcome? Do you want to grow in your public speaking skills? Maybe you're someone who's kind of shy and you want to be able to kind of lead workshops or events and things. Or maybe you're someone who's like, I really want to integrate more anti-oppressive practices into the work that I'm doing with my clients, right? So again, how do you want to grow is the first question. Related to that, what are your goals? Like, what are you trying to do, right? If you do this during your annuals, or maybe you have quarterly meetings around improvements and such, this could be a good question around, like, what are some of your quarterly goals? What are your annual goals? Again, wanting to connect that to what's the growth that you see for yourself? And then you're going to kind of come in with this question around, how do you like to receive feedback, right? And I would suggest offering, like, hey, I want us to have a conversation around feedback. I know feedback can be something that's traumatic. I want to do my best not to be that experience that you have with me. So I'd love us to have a conversation around how you ideally like to receive feedback. And I've got some questions for you, right? And you can ask those questions that I included in the last slide that, again, you can find in the Feel Good Feedback Guide. But this is the before, right? Kind of setting a semblance, letting the other person know we're going to be having a conversation around feedback. And so it's not something that should come only when I have negative or hard to hear stuff, but should just be part of our regular everyday. This is the before stage of that. Now for the during, right? Let's say you have feedback, you're working with someone and they really are interested in, integrating more trauma-informed or anti-oppressive practices, DEI skills into the work that they're doing. Before you give that feedback, I really want to urge you to ask for consent to give the feedback, right? Something that could sound like, hey, there's some feedback I'd like to give you. Is now a good time for that? And then that person can say, yeah, now's a good time, right? Y'all can sit down or meet or whatever, or maybe say, right now is not a good time, right? I'm super stressed, I'm trying to prepare for this other thing. And then if they say no, and I know it might be really hard for you, you're like, oh, I just saw this training, Petra did this thing, I really want to work on my feedback skills. I really want you to hold it though, right? And when I want you to respond back, instead of being like, no, this needs to happen right now, I want you to ask this person, okay, what will be a good time for us to talk about it then, right? It's not that we're never going to talk about feedback, but it's that right now might not be the best time. We want to honor that. Again, that is going to just change the game around co-creating this culture of feedback in your organization. And so I don't want you to miss this one around asking for consent before you give it. And then whether that feedback is happening at that time or at a later point that you two have scheduled, I really want you to give feedback in the way that that receiver of that feedback really wants it, right? And so think about, okay, if there's a certain framing, use that framing. If there is a certain time period or if it's like written or anything like that, I want you to honor some of those requests. And so here's the time to do that. And so that's the second stage, right? Here's what you're doing during when feedback is given. And then ideally, we're checking in post-feedback, right? We want to see how did we do after we did the thing. How did that go? And so I think about this as like the post-feedback stage. And so here's a place where really you want to check in around, hey, I gave you some feedback around how you could, integrate more of those anti-oppressive practices, or maybe I gave you some feedback on how you could elevate your public speaking skills. I just want to check in to see like how that landed for you now that it's been some time. Was it helpful? Is there anything I could do differently for next time? And like let them know, like, we really are trying to create a culture of feedback here. And so me hearing from you how that feedback landed, and ways that I could improve it for next time is really important to me, right? As whether you're a manager or a supervisor or just a colleague, wanting to check in and make that space to be like, hey, how did that land? Spend some time, let's check in around it. And so here's my suggestion around like how can you have a really round out how feedback happens. I think oftentimes we just kind of go towards this middle section where we are only giving feedback and then there's no preparation and then we don't check in around, okay, how did that land and how we can be improved, which might be the likely case. And so for here in this interpersonal section, you might want to grow and be like, okay, maybe we're only giving feedback or we're not even giving feedback now. Like just focus on trying to get feedback in this way. And then I would suggest implementing, okay, let's do the before feedback, right? Let's have a conversation around what ways do people want to receive feedback and then have the feedback. And then like the level up after that is like doing all three of these things, that you all have like a well-oiled machine around like we're talking about feedback before we give it, we're giving feedback, and then we're checking and following up in that feedback. Again, I've like supervised dozens of people in a variety of organizations, young people, adults, board members, like all variety of people. And so really want to encourage you to use some kind of like, this feels like a 360 to me, like a very holistic and kind of overarching way in order for you all to really get into that feedback giving muscle. Let me know if you have questions about this in the chat, or in the comment section. I'll give a second kind of just for that to set around like what can we be doing interpersonally in order for us to be co-creating that feedback culture. All right, and this is also a good time for you to do some self-assessment. How much of this are you currently doing? If you are engaging in feedback with your colleagues, with folks that you supervise, what part of this are you doing? Are you doing the before part? Are you just doing the during part? Are you probably want to be doing the post feedback? Is either you doing before or you doing during? So yeah, kind of take a second and assess, okay, where are you at? What might you could do? And again, feel free to ask questions in the comments in the chat if you have them. Great. So now I want us to move towards what can we do institutionally? And I want to offer, because I think oftentimes we can, if you're someone who's like, oh, the systems are broken, or maybe you're someone that's like, they aren't broken at all, they were created this way. I want to just remind us that systems are made up for people, and so while we might think that some of the policies and ways of being are kind of ingrained in these structures are made up of people, right? People are the ones that make these decisions. And so I want us to kind of bring our attention to that. We think about like, well, man, this kind of culture has been happening for so long. What can I do? Really just thinking about it. We're just trying to talk to people, right? Start with one conversation, one person, and depending on how strategic you are and what kind of understanding you have around the power of your organization, you might be really zoning in on a few select people, that could really change the game for shifting this culture away from one where I've noticed that if folks don't have a culture of feedback already, they're probably really steeped into this culture of politeness or niceness. And so I think one of the ways that like you can prepare and do your part as an individual to create this culture of feedback and do your part interpersonally with your colleagues and the folks that you're supervising. I think the other kind of arm of this work here is like to challenge some of the culture of politeness and niceness that might be happening at your organization. And so I'm going to kind of review a snippet of these because I find that probably folks already have some familiarity, but I kind of go through them. And then I'll offer for a few what you might be doing in order to challenge these in a really practical way. But if there's anyone that you find that I may not touch upon, please put the number in the chat, and I'll make sure to include that one in my review, in my consideration of what you can do to challenge some of these things. So feel free to put the number if I don't automatically choose that one. But let me just kind of review and give you a sense of what each one is. So one of the characteristics of this culture of politeness and niceness is, I'll start with number one, around the punishment for speaking up. Maybe folks are, maybe they do try to give some feedback, some constructive criticism, and people are then given extra work. And so I know sometimes it might be like, hey, could we send out a feedback form after the workshop that we just held? We really want to hear from our clients and our members what they thought about that workshop. And then sometimes the response is like, okay, great, can you do it? Which is like, feels like a punishment for speaking up, right? Because that person is then getting added extra responsibilities because they likely aren't, there's not anything else going to be taken off their plate. And so that feels kind of like a punishment for speaking up. And so that could really be contributing to why people are not sharing feedback freely. So that's number one. Two, it might be that there might be some conflict avoidance where people don't ever want to look at what could be better. Maybe folks are afraid to share critiques. There might be a negativity bias that maybe the only time that anything is shared is when it's negative, right? And I think we often think about feedback as like only for the negative stuff, but feedback also includes like when people are doing a damn good job and just may not be hearing that. And so how can we be thoughtful that that is one of the characteristics, is that sometimes people are trying to avoid conflict because of sometimes trauma, sometimes they experience a whole host of things. But also when things are brought up, it's only negative things. So that's like a thing we want to watch. The third one is that there might be some stigma against questioning the status quo. And so maybe there are folks who, this kind of connects to the one with punishment, maybe folks who do say something are given extra work because of it, or maybe folks who do speak up and kind of share their opinion about something that could be different, then they are no longer invited to meetings. Maybe they're not allowed to be in certain projects anymore. So there's this stigmatization, this marginalization that happens to those people. And so that's another characteristic. There might be this fourth one where really there's a culture of prioritizing niceness over meaningful inclusion. And this one is really about like, oh, everyone's like, oh, we're a family here, we love everyone. But meanwhile, people are shooting the shit in the bathroom, right? They're talking shit. There's a debrief after the meeting. Again, because people are afraid of engaging in that conflict. They're afraid of being direct with one another. But they think just because everyone is like smiling 1 second, that really means that people feel included, like they belong, which is really necessary for people to feel good about, sharing feedback, sharing something that they could be different, even acknowledging one another is really necessary. The fifth one, this one is around the fear of repercussions. And so let's say someone has a fear, or maybe there's an example where someone has spoken up. Maybe they have given some tough to hear feedback to someone in leadership, perhaps, and they've been fired, right? Or maybe they've been put on a PIP, a performance improvement plan. Like there's definitely been repercussions, and so that also creates this environment where like, shit, let me not say nothing because my job might be on the line. There could be sixes when there is a lack of feedback training, right? And maybe there's like, it's just maybe your organization doesn't have a proper HR department, or maybe HR is steeped in some very outdated ideas around what feedback should look like present day. And so there just might be a lack of training that's happening, contributing to why people are steeped in this culture of politeness or niceness. And then the seventh one that I've seen is the no news is good news mentality, right? That some people, their sense is like, well, no one has told me anything either constructive or affirming about what I'm doing, so it must be good. And so again, that can kind of speak to why people may not know that you, as an organization, want to have a culture feedback because no one's given it. They're like, oh, it's great. No one has said anything bad, which is that's not a good sign, right? We really want to have that active communication. And so let me share and speak on a few of these of how you might be able to question it. I'm thinking about let's say for 6 is probably one of the easiest, right? That maybe you bring in some formal feedback training. Maybe you share as a team leader or solo leader, you're like, hey, I'd really like support around how I can give feedback in a different kind of way. Here's some things that I feel like could be improved. Maybe you share this video with them. Maybe you share the guide that I have with them around like, oh, maybe we can bring in someone to speak about some of these issues, right? Just a few talking points around what's missing, and then come up with some reasons about why you think that would be helpful. Another one that you might can help to challenge is really, I'm thinking about the one for the conflict avoidance. I think about how sometimes we want to try something new. We might want to try it in the biggest scale. And so maybe it's at a meeting with a whole bunch of people who have more leadership power than you do, or more positional power. And you're like, okay, I want to try to engage conflict here. That might not be the place to do it, right? But maybe with you and your colleague in a one-on-one scenario, you two are trying to hash out some stuff, right? To try to give feedback or think about like, well, shoot, I really want to be able to give this feedback, this constructive criticism, or want to be able to say this thing, and I'm not sure how. I'm always a fan of like, don't try to do stuff by yourself, right? And don't try to do things in the largest or grandest scales. Think smaller, right? What are the smaller practices and ways that you could be able to try this thing? I think this really comes from my practice around emergent strategy and think about fractals, and how there is a repetition with like whatever we want at the largest scale is happening at the smallest scale, right? And so if I'm working with my direct support around how we can engage feedback in the way that I'm teaching you today, around it being consent-based, around it being trauma-aware, around it being generative, we are practicing what that could be like, right? And maybe the person that you're supervising can do that with someone else in the organization, or maybe you start to feel a little bit confident because you were trying that and that dynamic, that you're like, okay, maybe I can do it with someone else, right? Or maybe at least I can have a conversation on like, hey, I've been trying this thing with the person, with my direct support. I'd really like to bring this to a larger stage, so to speak. So I think around the conflict avoidance piece, I think start small, right? Or if someone you're like, I really don't like conflict, start trying little tiny acts of like, let me get engaged with conflict in small ways. Maybe I just share like, oh, hey, I disagree about something like that. It doesn't have to be something big. Again, if there's anyone that you want me to talk through around how you might be able to challenge this at the institutional level, feel free to put that in the chat or in the comments. I'm going to do one more, and then I'll kind of move us to the next stage. I think for number 7, like the no news is good news mentality, I think it's really starting to start to share feedback. You know, like maybe maybe what you take away from this video is like, okay, I know what I can do as a person. I can ask for feedback in ways that I'd like it. Start there, right? That even you naming like, hey, I just did, you know, in terms of my own professional development, I'm learning how I like to receive feedback. So we have a conversation about feedback during your one-on-ones, during your check-ins with your manager, maybe a team meeting if that seems appropriate. I really like to share like some of the stuff that I'm learning. Is there space for that? You know, and then so that we can start to challenge the idea that, oh, we don't have these conversations. Someone's got to start it, you know, and maybe you can be that person to start it. And then you can try to find allies as they're doing that work, so it doesn't all fall on you. Yeah. Okay. Beautiful. So I think the next thing I want to kind of like put a bow on this conversation. My business is called Create More Possibilities, and I'm always thinking about like what's possible, right? When we start to live in alignment with our values, when we start to use our voice as the powerhouses that it is, when we start to embrace our identity and our ideas as marginalized and racialized folks, what's possible? And so I want to kind of paint a little picture for you, give you a little oomph, you know, to kind of get your brain going and help you kind of think about, okay, how might I be able to integrate this into my work? And I want to share a best case scenario and then a worst case scenario, which is also not that bad. But for a best case scenario, right? In the best case, if you are someone who takes the things that are within this video, maybe you download the Feel Good Feedback Guide, and you start to implement and you start doing your part around co-creating a culture of feedback in your organization. Here's what's possible for you, right? So this is the work that I've done. In the best case scenario, you may really change the game for at least one person, right? Because I think, like I share with feedback, some people think that feedback is only constructive, but feedback can also be like the good stuff. And so I want to name here that by you engaging with this really difficult thing around giving feedback in a way that people will really be able to receive and for it to feel good, I want you to know that can really change the game for someone. And I just think about the ripple effect of that. And so I want to highlight here I've been doing this process for years with the folks that I supervise, with the folks that I work with. And I wanted to highlight here, if you're someone who, like me, like will put on a YouTube video and kind of do something else, but I'll just kind of provide a voice version of what is here. Here's a comment from one of the folks that I supervised years ago, that started seeing my work online and me talking about this stuff. And she was just like, put respect on Petra's name. I love them for that. But they had shared here in a comment, I have been supervised by you in a workplace, and all I can say is that she means every word. I miss your leadership, led with grace and compassion. It was a very healing experience to have someone who understands my struggles as a single mother in New York City. I'm forever grateful for what you taught me in that time. In the best case scenario, you really are able to revolutionize someone's experience about what work can feel and what can happen at work. And I always think about and then they can take that somewhere else, right? So that they can spot when their jobs are not treating them well, and if they are in a position or have the je ne sais quoi, the oomph to want to create that kind of culture, imagine what that could be like for people, So I want to offer that as in the best case scenario, the culture feedback really lands and people are able to feel really welcomed and affirmed and really feel like this is a place where people can actually grow and not be, not have it suck so much, So I think that work is already so hard. I don't think we need to make it harder. But I want to offer, if you're like, I'm not in a space to implement any of these things, or I'm not too sure, or I think my organization is far gone, I want to offer in the worst case scenario around what can happen. And so here I kind of read about just this little snippet of, I was at a nonprofit that didn't have a culture of feedback, and this was a place, and another one of the places where I've tested these different approaches, these different strategies around what feel good feedback is like in practice. And unfortunately, the organization was not receptive to those things, right? What needed to happen at the institutional level did not happen, and I was at the crossroads of harm in a feedback scenario situation. And it turns out that the snippet I'm going to read for you is my response to a former supervisor who was really enabling this culture of politeness and niceness and was complicit in the harm that was happening as a result of this culture, that really wasn't open to feedback and often targeted, punished people for speaking up. I was punished for speaking up, and so I know that characteristic really well. But later on, this person had came to ask for my forgiveness and had seen the light around the error of their ways. And so I kind of just want to do a voiceover around even if you do nothing with what I've shared in this video, that is not the end, right? There still might be something that someone can still be changed by your efforts of trying to create this culture of feedback. And so I just want to share from my perspective, what I told this person and how I was able to communicate. Again, I help people speak up. So I want you to see the ways in which how you can speak up and stand up for yourself, but also hold the humanity of another person. And so I want to just kind of give a voiceover of the little snippets that I shared, but we had a longer conversation with this. But again, here's the snippet. So I had shared with this person, I appreciate you acknowledging how you were complicit in allowing a toxic work environment to fester, sometimes passively by not using your power and positional power, sometimes by not using your power and positional power. He's saying power is voice, by not using your voice and positional power, and other times actively targeted at me. My hope is that you are focusing your efforts on what you can do now in your new role as an executive director and preventing what happened to me, more so than how you didn't show up for me years ago. You have an opportunity to set the course for co-creating an environment where people can do good work and feel good while they do it. I hope you can rise to the occasion. Doing that is how you can earn my forgiveness, okay? And so, again, worst case scenario, you take nothing away from this video, you try nothing from this video, and the status quo continues. But I just want to offer that maybe if you were to take some of these efforts, there might be someone down the line that does come back at you years later, or maybe you get a hint from the universe that's that mattered, your efforts mattered. So I kind of just want to offer that to you around what's possible in the best and worst case scenario. All right, so rounding us out here, again, I've been talking at length around my Feel Good Feedback Guide. Really, she is so robust. She has different scenarios. I go deeper into the before, the during, and after feedback. I share what are some areas not to touch when you're thinking about giving feedback to someone. I give a fuck ton of questions and prompts and examples around how people like to receive feedback and how you can actually play by play have that conversation with people. So that you're welcome to use that at your organization. And also will add you to my email list will be an option to do, so you can continue to get support around how you can leverage your voice as a powerful tool that it is. So if you haven't already, you have a few more seconds to scan the QR code with your phone if you're watching this on a TV or on your desktop. And if not, you can always go to tinyurl.com/Petras with an S feedback guide, and you can find the guide there. This will also be in the description box as well after this video, so you can always search for it there.